Okay, this event is interesting because I'm alone, but we have a full room across from where I am with in-person participants and all of you online. So thank you all for coming in person, and also thanks for all of you online joining us. I do want to thank our funders, Faculty of Health, Communications and Education Innovation Fund, the 2S LGBTQ Health Hub, and the support of QriTical, Queer and Trans Research Hub. We are also grateful for the support of many of our colleagues, you here, the attendees, and of course our panelists who agreed to share their time, thoughts, and knowledge with us today. We began to organize the Teach-In sometime last year after the UCP proposed legislation. Most recently, Bill 29, the Fairness, Safety in Sport Act, was introduced by the UCP on October 31st. Premier Danielle Smith proposed this new legislation promotes female athlete competition. However, by doing so, it is not only limiting but restricting transgender women and girls' accessibility, equity, and access to fair play in sport. Bill 29, in instituting new restrictions and empowering transphobia, also has the potential to limit access to sport for all trans people from elementary school to the professional levels. In response to this bill, the organizers, Dr. Celeste Pang, Dr. Marty Clark, and myself, Gio Dolcicori, thought it relevant to invite transgender athletes to speak about their lived experience and knowledge on policies and legislation in sport. These panelists are here to discuss the impact policies and shifting social views have on transgender community, to counter misinformation and provide clarity on the basis towards transgender athletes. We have put together a resource package. For those of you in person, you'll see a QR code for that resource package. For those of you online, I will enter the link in the chat momentarily. I do want to welcome all of you again for participating. Having these conversations is extremely important at this time. I also want to provide a land acknowledgement. Mount Royal University is situated on an ancient and storied land steeped in ceremony and history that, until recently, was occupied exclusively by people indigenous to this place. With gratitude and reciprocity, Mount Royal acknowledges the relationship to the land and all beings and all songs, stories, and teachings of the Siksika Nation, the Kainai Nation, the Gani Nation, and the Iati and Stoney Nakoda Nation, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Good Stoney Nations, the people of Tsuut'ina Nation, and Métis. At the verbal negotiations held to discuss Treaty 7 between the nations and the Crown and the Canadian government, Indigenous peoples assumed hereditary lands would be shared and cooperative future would be built together that was to last as long as the grass grows, the sun shines, and the river flows. However, many of the verbal promises made to those nations were not reflected in the written version of Treaty 7, created by the Crown and the Canadian government. Even then, many promises that were included in the written version have been broken. What followed were policies of cultural genocide and assimilation that caused profound harm. We now know these Indigenous communities understood gender outside of the colonized binaries influenced by European states and the church. We now know that the Blackfoot people had up to 7 genders identified, while the Cree had 5 that were celebrated. The original people of these lands were confined to reserves, prohibited from pursuing traditional practices, and forced to send their children to residential schools. Rather than building meaningful and mutually beneficial relationships, there were dispositioned and exploitation and systems of economic and social marginalization. As such, Mount Royal University is committed to advancing the success of Indigenous learners and respectfully supporting Indigenous cultures, identities, and integrity, leading to a good life in all aspects. Mount Royal will challenge settler colonialism, systemic racism, and discrimination by addressing the legacy of broken promises and rebuilding the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. I would like to introduce our panelists at this time. I'm so excited to introduce the group of panelists that we have today. So if you see me smiling and bouncing around, it's just because I'm their biggest fans. Today we have Jessica Platt, who uses she, her pronouns. Jessica is a retired professional hockey player. She played for the Toronto Furies in the Canadian Women's Hockey League, the CWHL, followed by Toronto in the Professional Women's Hockey Players Association, which was a predecessor to the new Toronto PWHL team. While playing professionally, she has been part of the fight for sustainable professional hockey league that young girls could dream to play like their male peers. She is the first out trans woman to play professional hockey in North America. Jessica continues to advocate for trans athletes in sports, as well as for equity in sports with a special focus on hockey. We also have Eb Campbell, they, them. Eb is a non-binary national level trampoline gymnast, athlete living in Regina, Saskatchewan. They have been openly competing as trans since 2022 and was one half of the fully trans mixed synchro winning pair at the 2024 Elite Canada. When not doing gymnastics, they also play roller derby and have participated in a number of other sports over their life, including taekwondo, field hockey, and aikido. We have Valentina Petrillo, she, her. Valentina is the first out trans athlete to compete in the Paralympic Games, competing in Paris in 2024. Born in 1973 in Napoli, Italy, at the age of 14, Valentina was diagnosed with Stargardt syndrome, which quickly compromised her central vision, making her severely visually impaired. Despite her illness and the difficult social context, she demonstrated for adolescents a strong aptitude for sports, particularly track and field and soccer. Going on to compete in soccer and track and field, including winning 12 national Paralympic titles. In 2018, she began, she began her gender affirming process in the women's category, which led her in September of 2020 to fulfill her dream. Eliza will be translating for Valentina today. Then we have Ryder Richard, they and he interchangeably. Ryder is an Alberta-based trans athlete, coach, and inclusive sports advocate. They have played sledge hockey for 15 years, including time with Team Trans, an all-trans sledge hockey team, and has been a coach for the last 3 years. We now have Eva Bošnjak, they, them. Eva is an equity, diversity, and inclusion practitioner working to deconstruct and recreate systems and structures that harm equity-denied communities. They have a master's in sociocultural aspects of sports and physical activity, and their thesis explored the experience of trans and gender nonconforming persons in sports. As a trans-masculine, non-binary person and former competitive athlete, they are deeply passionate about trans and non-binary inclusion in sport. Eva has worked with national and provincial sport organizations across so-called Canada. Through their work, they seek to reimagine sporting cultures in ways that challenge the status quo. Now, do you understand why I'm so excited? To start this teach-in, I'm going to begin by asking 2 to 3 questions to our panelists. Once these questions are done, that's when I will open for Q&A. For the folks who are in person, I'm sure you've already been told, but there are QR codes that you can scan to submit your questions. And for those of us online, please use the chat function for those questions, and I will do my best to get to as many questions as possible. So we will start with Jessica Platt. Again, Jessica, thanks so much for being here. I'll start with the first question. Can you please tell us how hockey has impacted your life? How has hockey and sport supported you throughout your life?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. But hockey has had a profound impact in my life. It's, it's the game that I fell in love with growing up. So I'm going to start with kind of the negative aspects and then work into positive because I like to end on a good note. So the negative aspects, the culture and the social aspects surrounding hockey that I experienced when I was growing up kind of gave me a skewed idea of how I thought that I needed to act, how I thought I needed to be. I wasn't really exposed to much diversity. I was led to believe that, how I felt was bad, it was wrong, it was something to be suppressed, because the atmosphere that I played hockey in was, macho guys. You had to be tough. You had to act a certain way, and anybody that stepped out of that norm was ridiculed, made fun of. They were kind of on the set aside to the outside. They weren't really as much a part of the team, it felt like, at least. So surrounding hockey, it wasn't great. But on the positive side, it gave me an outlet. On the ice, hockey was an escape for me. It was somewhere that I could go where all I had to think about was the game, nothing else going on in my life, just what I had to do on the ice. And that was incredible for me. Thankfully, when I came out publicly, I received a lot of love and support, which was incredible. I always say the women's hockey world is primarily a very supportive community. So that was incredible for me. I know that's not a universal experience. I know that there are some trans women who get pushback in their leagues. So I know I was very lucky. There was some pushback overall, but I was welcomed, and the ability to really play as myself, unburdened by, hiding my past, it really pushed my drive and my motivation further. And it also impacted me as a fan. And it was very complicated because there was a lack of diversity in hockey, but I loved the beauty and the skill in the game, but I didn't really feel a sense of belonging. I felt like I was kind of on the outside looking in. I was enjoying it, but I didn't feel like I was a part of it. And the support throughout my life, it's been mixed support. As an athlete, playing the sport was incredible. I learned a lot about hard work, teamwork, perseverance, dealing with failures and successes. And in many ways, it shaped who I am today. Sports have that power. Sports are something that are truly special. They have the ability to bring us together. They can teach us so much about ourselves and about others. And, they can teach us so many great things. But unfortunately, I was subject to some of the negative aspects of that power, which really delayed my acceptance of who I truly was and in finding true happiness. So I had stepped away from the game, and I came back later on once I figured out what I had to do to be happy. And, I ended up finding happiness and acceptance at the end of the journey. So that was incredible. So hockey's been great, kind of mixed feelings.
Thanks for sharing, Jessica. What misconceptions are affecting transgender athletes' rights in hockey that you would like to address?
Speaking personally from my experiences, I know I see a lot of people online who think that you can just, self-identify as a woman one day and play in the women's categories. But at the level that I was playing at, like the more elite levels, there are typically guidelines and regulations set in place to kind of, negate any unfair advantage that some people might think that we have. And that unfair advantage and that people think that we have really comes from a misogynistic viewpoint that women are inherently worse than men, that they are smaller, they're stronger, they're weaker than men. And, that's not always the case. It's all works. It's all on an individual basis. Those kind of viewpoints that men have that inherent advantage really take away from the work that myself as a trans athlete would put in, and yeah, it undervalues the work we put in to get to an elite level. Another thought I had was, who's going to give up their privileges as a cis male for little to no money as a pro athlete in women's sports? So that's another thing that I have to look at. You're going to worry about being judged constantly. You're going to risk rejection, harassment, violence. And personally, when I transitioned, I lost a sense of my safety. So, people have this idea that people transition to win, but people transition to be happy. If they can play sports after, that's great.
I couldn't agree more with that statement. Absolutely. Thanks, Jessica. My last question for you is, what drives your advocacy?
Ever since I was young, I've had a desire to do the best I can, to do what I can to make the world better. I think that, comes from my parents. I try and do what's right and what I feel is right, and try and make the world a better place, because there are so many people out there who just bring negativity and hatred into the world that, I'll try and cancel that out as best as I can. Personally, I was given a unique opportunity that to do good in the world, to give people with similar experiences to me a solid representation of a trans person succeeding, and most importantly, being happy in their life. So that's one thing that drives me. Another is, the positive messages I get from people telling me about the positive effect I've had in their life. That makes me want to keep going, because it really reaffirms that what I'm able to do is helpful. And lastly, and most weirdly, the negative comments actually drive me to continue in my advocacy, because it shows me that there's still a need to educate people on different perspectives that they may not be exposed to, and that I still have the potential to change people's minds.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Even the negative comments can light that fire that we need to do the work that is necessary. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to be moving over to Eb Campbell again. Thanks so much for joining us all the way from Saskatchewan. My first question for you is, what misconceptions are affecting transgender athletes' right in gymnastics that you would like to address?
Well, as Jessica said, thanks for having me. I think the gymnastics is in a bit of a weird spot, because you get all those people online spewing all the things saying trans people have an advantage in sports, but maybe not in gymnastics. Because so much of gymnastics is not based on speed. It's not based on strength or size. And for a lot of parts of it, being a little bit too strong, being a little bit too tall can be detriments. You don't see a lot of really, really tall, artistic, at least, gymnasts. So, like, gymnastics is also just really exceptionally gendered in how it's set up. For artistic gymnastics, which is what people generally think of, it's the beam, the bars, floor, vaults, rings. Men's and women's categories are actually fully separate sports. They have different rules. They have different events. They have a little bit of overlap, but there's a lot of difference between them. And for like rhythmic gymnastics, in most of the world, men don't even compete. It's fully women's. Gymnastics also starts incredibly young. Most people will have retired by the time they graduate high school, if not before. It is getting a little bit older, but it's mostly a very young sport. And some trans athletes will, because of this, just decide to wait until they're done to come out, or they will come out but stay competing in the category they started in, because moving over isn't really a choice. Like you can move from women's to men's artistic, but you're starting a new sport. And because it specializes so young, that's really hard. The kind of gymnastics that I do trampoline and tumbling, is a lot more co-ed. There tends to be still more women's competitors. The men's categories in trampoline and tumbling are smaller. But everyone trains together. It's a very, we train together, we compete together, even if we're not competing against each other. In Saskatchewan, we don't actually have enough people to split the lower levels. So for provincial level gymnastics in Saskatchewan, it's not gendered at all. So all this to say, I think the big misconception in gymnastics is that it's somehow fundamentally different from other sports in how trans athletes can exist. But the same things are important for inclusion in all sports. There's just a little bit more mental gymnastics you need to make it work for more non-traditional sports. And it makes it a little bit more obvious when people are saying, when are advocating for exclusion, that it's not really about sports.
Yeah, those are great points. And I'm grateful that you're also talking about the different forms of gymnastics, because most people do categorize it as just one clump sport when it's just way more intricate than that. My second question for you is, in terms of advocacy that you have been involved in making, what information has been most beneficial for policymakers to know when making sport policies?
I think the most important thing to realize is that most people participating in sports are not going to make it to the elite level. Some of us will, but the majority of people just want to participate in lower level, recreational, non-competitive, lower level competitive stuff. And like for the people who do get to the elite levels, like they're all coming from a different place. They all want different things out of their career. So for those athletes, it's going to be more of an individual case-by-case basis. But having a good base in a policy is really important to everyone. It's also keeping in mind the things that affect your sport in particular. So maybe your sport doesn't really have uniforms, or the uniforms are already really gender neutral. Maybe they're not, but they could be. Gymnastics Canada, I believe it is written now, moved to a policy where you have to be competing in competition attire, but it doesn't matter which competition attire. Yeah, at least for trampoline and tumbling. Trampoline and tumbling, you can choose women's, men's. I have a teammate who still competes in women's, but a lot of the time will prefer wearing the men's uniform. It's considering things like, does your practice space already have gender neutral washrooms? Could they have gender neutral washrooms? Is it an option? And there's just a lot of things that seem like a big deal that get people all up in arms. They're like, we need to figure all this out. And they're really not a big deal for your particular sports environments. Like trampoline and tumbling, because we already all train together, we're already all competing in the same place at the same time. Like it's really just what category you're competing in, what you're wearing. Like that would all be all that would change regardless. And remembering that things don't have to be perfect to be a step in the right direction. You maybe wouldn't be able to put in a gender neutral washroom to accommodate non-binary or just anyone who wants a gender neutral washroom because of your space. You know, maybe you can't do construction, maybe you are limited by renting a facility. But just because you can't make everything happen doesn't mean you can't make some of it happen. And you can start somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm grateful that you said that things don't have to be perfect, right? I think a lot of times when we're talking about inclusion in sports, inclusion in policies and equity, We're in this notion that things have to be perfect, but perfect and inclusion are conversations to be had based on what's around, right? And my final question for you is, what have you found joyous about your experiences?
I like that as a non-binary athlete, I have kind of found a way to compete in every part of my identity. So I compete men's for trampoline and tumbling. I moved over to competing men's in 2022. But I also play roller derby, and I play for a women's league. Roller derby does have a very, very inclusive gender policy. So they are very explicitly open to non-binary people as well. But it's kind of fun to be able to get to do a little bit of everything. I'm also found myself training and competing with just some really great supportive people, and even found some great administrators who are helping things get better. And I love to see it. Canada, well, Western Canada, a few years ago introduced mixed synchronized trampoline before it was just men's and women's synchronized trampoline. And because of this, my teammate, who's also non-binary but still competes in the women's category, we get to compete this together. So we like to joke that we are an unmixed mixed pair. And we won this year, which was pretty great. And I like, in that vein, I really like watching other trans athletes succeed. I went from coming out and just assuming that I would probably be the only one to there are a number of us competing. Not a ton, but there are a few. And I love watching us all get to succeed and continue to do sports as ourselves.
Yeah, I'm grateful that you are saying that there might not be a lot of us in sports, but when we do see each other in sport, it's a big deal, right? It's a really big deal to encourage each other. I think many of us probably can relate to growing up in an era where we didn't get to see someone like us in sports. Like, we didn't have role models growing up, which is why seeing all of you here today, I'm like, like, you are my role model. So it's really great to have you here and to speak to that importance as well. Valentina, I have questions for you. And like I mentioned earlier during the welcoming, Eliza will be translating for Valentina. So my first question is, can you tell us about what it means to be a trans athlete in Italy and/or Europe, and what learning or lessons may be useful for us in a Canadian context?
Questa era la prima domanda che ti avevano già fatto.
Sì.
Ok, vai.
Me la vuoi ripetere?
Sì, che cosa significa essere un atleta trans in Italia e in Europa e quali sono le lezioni che possono essere utili in un contesto canadese?
Allora, le persone trans in Europa e in Italia stanno vedendo un po' la situazione che anche avete descritto prima delle altre ragazze, è un po' simile.
In Italy, trans people, it's kind of similar to what we have heard up until now.
Quello che secondo me è l'aspetto più importante è quello di fare informazione presso i tecnici e presso gli addetti ai lavori.
The main thing is to provide information to the people who work in sports and who have a saying, like technicians and trainers and so forth.
È molto importante raccontare le storie delle persone transgender perché possono essere veicolo per sensibilizzare l'opinione pubblica.
It's very important to tell the stories of transgender people because it's a vehicle to sensitize public opinion.
E da questo punto di vista c'è ancora tanto lavoro da fare perché comunque le persone non conoscono le situazioni delle persone transgender, e nel mio caso c'è anche il discorso della disabilità, e quindi l'aspetto delle persone di essere transgender e anche disabile visivo, questo è ancora molto più evidente perché non si conoscono entrambi le situazioni che comunque diciamo situazioni di una persona diversa.
So there is still a lot of work to do, and in my case, there is also another aspect because I'm a disabled person, so people are really not aware of what it means to be a trans person and with a disability. So there is really a lot of work to do still.
Io ho avuto tanti problemi, soprattutto nel mondo senza disabilità, mentre nel mondo paralimpico c'è stata un'inclusione un'inclusione piena.
So I had a lot of problems, especially in the normal, so-called normal world, normal sports, with people without disabilities, whereas in the disability sector, in the Paralympic sector, I've had a better experience.
Riguardo la legislazione qui in Italia, siamo rimasti molto indietro a livello proprio di legislazione, infatti abbiamo una legge del 1982, quindi non abbiamo l'affermazione, l'autoaffermazione di genere.
So legislation in Italy is still really backward. We still refer to main law written in 1982, which doesn't allow for self-affirmation, self-gender affirmation.
Quindi siamo costretti ancora oggi a fare ricorso a tribunali che non sempre ci concedono appunto il cambio di genere e poi dobbiamo avere le nostre vite devono essere patologizzate, cioè deve essere dimostrato che noi abbiamo una patologia e dobbiamo per forza intraprendere una terapia ormonale.
So we still have to go to court in order to, affirm our gender choice. And we also have to undergo psychological evaluation. So we're still considered people with the pathology.
Come detto prima, io posso portare il mio esempio nel mondo paralimpico, dello sport paralimpico, perché comunque è un esempio virtuoso, in quanto io ho avuto una piena inclusione.
So the example of my path in the Paralympic world is a very positive example, a very positive story, because I've had a full inclusion in this world.
Io penso che si possa prendere il mondo paralimpico come esempio, in quanto esistono tante categorie nel mondo paralimpico e quindi secondo me può essere un modello esportabile anche nel mondo olimpico. Diciamo che bisogna assolutamente superare il concetto di binarismo di genere.
So the interesting thing is that we could even use the Paralympic world as an example, because it provides for many different categories, of course, regarding different disabilities. And we could, in fact, export this model, which also doesn't concentrate on binarism.
Vorrei sottolineare il fatto che comunque la persona trans vive una condizione. La mia non è una scelta di essere una persona trans, ma io sono una persona trans e questa mia condizione non deve costituire un elemento di discriminazione come spesso succede.
So I want to underline that being a trans person is not a choice, and cosa hai detto l'ultima parte?
Che non deve essere un elemento di discriminazione la mia condizione di essere persona transgender.
So this condition of being a transgender person shouldn't be a motivation for discrimination, of course.
E tra l'altro tutto ciò senza studi scientifici che dimostrano appunto che l'essere nata maschio mi dia un vantaggio biologico. Anzi,
Also, we don't have scientific studies that demonstrate that the fact that I was born a male gives me an advantage in sports.
gli unici studi che sono stati condotti da parte del CIO, che sono poi alla base della decisione del CIO di eliminare anche i controlli ormonali, è quello che il fatto che una persona transgender è invece sfavorita rispetto agli uomini cisgender e alle donne cisgender.
So the only studies that were done by the IOC and that have led the IOC to take away the hormonal criteria demonstrate that transgender people, in fact, have a disadvantage. Transgender women. Donne transgender, giusto?
Sì,
Sì.
sì, sì.
Ok.
Finish.
Thank you, Valentina. There's a few things that you said that absolutely we can not just relate to that here in Canada, but need to hear the voices of trans folks from around the world being visible, having allyship in the right positions. All positions are the right positions for allies to be in, and laws need to be updated. And most importantly, laws need to represent the current contexts of what's happening right now. So that brings me to my second question, Valentina. Can you please tell us about your experience in the Paralympic sporting world?
Ti chiede qual è la tua esperienza nello sport paralimpico.
Nello sport paralimpico in particolare, io non ho esperienze tutte positive, probabilmente derivanti da un diverso modo di approcciare per proprio skill personale, perché ogni persona, ovviamente nel mondo paralimpico, ha vissuto a sua volta una diversità e quindi secondo me rende una maggiore inclusione.
The Paralympic world has given me all positive experiences because in the Paralympic world, the diversity is the key word in a sense. So we are always thinking of different diversities and in an inclusive sport world.
A Parigi io ho realizzato il mio sogno da bambina e da Parigi arriva forte un messaggio da parte mia, consapevole che la mia corsa sia stata una corsa non solo di Valentina, ma di tutte le persone, in particolare LGBTQIA+, ma in generale di tutte e tutti.
Non riesco, in Paris, I realized my dream since I was a child, and the fact that I was in Paris is not only my personal realization, but a realization for a lot of people belonging to the LGBTQA world.
Anche se non me l'aspettavo, ho trovato un clima anche a livello di spettatori molto caloroso.
I wasn't expecting it, but I found a very warm welcoming from the audience, from the people participating in the Paralympics, the public.
Questo mi ha fatto capire che la società rispetto allo sport è molto più pronta per includere.
So I understood from that society is more ready than the actual sports organizations to include people.
E da Parigi, dalla mia esperienza di Parigi, quella di Parigi è un punto di partenza, non è un punto di arrivo.
My experience in Paris is a starting point, is not an end point.
È stato importante che una persona come me, una persona transgender, una donna transgender, sia riuscita ad arrivare a questi livelli, e credo che questo valore vada oltre ogni medaglia.
It's important that a transgender person like me has arrived at this level, and this goes beyond the value of any medal.
Per la prima volta forse si è parlato di persone trans collegandole ad un cronometro, e questo è molto importante perché bisogna che le nostre vite sono molto di più di quelle di essere persone trans. Io sono una sportiva e così vorrei essere ricordata.
Okay, so for the first time, transgender people were associated with a chronometer, and this is a very important thing, and I want to be remembered for that.
Ho tenuto anche molto, molto a cuore parlare con tutte le televisioni del mondo per spiegare alcune cose. In particolare ho parlato anche con il mondo dei media, dei giornalisti, ai quali ho chiesto anche da parte loro un cambio anche sul modo di raccontare le nostre storie, le nostre vite, perché è importante.
Ma me la ridici tutta. So I spoke a lot with the journalists, and I asked also the various journalists from around the world to make a change in the way they tell our stories.
Io ho la netta sensazione che da Parigi davvero abbiamo, e ho la speranza che da Parigi abbiamo messo un punto fermo sulle vite delle persone trans e non vorrei più sentir parlare di discriminazioni.
So I have the feeling that in Paris we have really made a statement about transgender people's lives, and I really don't want to hear anymore about discrimination.
Ok.
Thank you, Valentina. Ryder, you're up next with a few questions. So the first question I have for you, Ryder, is can you please tell us about your experience as a sledge hockey player and coach?
Okay. This can be like a two-part question. So basically I'm a sledge hockey player. I played on two different teams. One of which is like just a regular co-ed team, and then one is like a transgender all trans team. Basically we were on the very first para hockey version of Team Trans because they had done it for stand-up plenty of times, but then they just were like, all right, I guess we need it for you guys too. But basically I was on a team before my recent co-ed team, and they were not, and everybody thinks they hear disability and they think, oh, it's inclusive, and it's not always that case. For me, they had separate change rooms, which was fine. I was like, whatever. But then they would make me change by myself. Like, it was really bad. And like they were saying that it was part of Hockey Alberta, and I went to Hockey Alberta, and they're like, no, this is not the case. So I think like the hockey associations itself, like whether it be Hockey Alberta, Hockey Canada, whatever, I think they're more inclusive than some of the sports organizations, is what I'm seeing. But yeah, I ended up switching from that team, and I'm on a better team now. It's way more inclusive. They really don't care as long as you can play, which is how it should be. And then for coaching, the kids really don't care. Like, they're just like, all right, cool. Like, whatever. So like I coach mostly disabled kids. We have some kids that aren't disabled because of the nature of my sport. It's just more of like whoever wants to play can play. And yeah, no, those, they really don't care about who you are or whatever. As long as you're nice to them and you treat them well, that's all they really care about, is what I'm noticing, especially with kids. But yeah.
Nice, yes. Kids just want to play and have fun, right? Right. And I think that's the most important thing. When we talk about sport and inclusion, we have to think about kids, we have to think about their ability to access their opportunities to play in sport and the effects that has on their well-being, both mental health and physical health, right? So my second question for you, Ryder, is what have you found joyous about your experiences?
I think Team Trans was like the big joyous opportunity. It was really cool, especially like when we first all met and like we just went around. We're like, "What's your pronouns?" And I'm just like, "Wait, that exists? People do that?" But yeah, no, that was the most joyous part, I think, in my whole experience. Just being able to play and nobody really caring. They're just like, all right, cool, like play the position you know how to play. We really don't care.
It's remarkable what happens when we feel welcomed, right? Yeah. And then my last question for you, Ryder, is what drives your advocacy?
I think it's a lot of my experiences, and like I have a family member that is also trans, and him trying to access the programs that he wants at 8 years old and him being denied. And it's not because the policies are in effect yet, it's more because a lot of these sports organizations are scared to, because they're scared of losing funding if they do. And obviously he doesn't want to go on a girls team because he doesn't feel comfortable or safe there, and he's just like, no, I'd rather just not play at all, which is also not fair to him. And then just seeing like that I'm not the only disabled trans athlete this has happened to, and I'm just like, something has to change, because everybody seems to think that if you're disabled, that disabled sports organizations are super inclusive, and that is not always the case.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Ryder. And it's good to note that we're not alone, right?
Yeah.
We're never alone, even when we feel like we might be the only one. We don't live in silo, right? We live in community, and we also grow in community. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ryder. I really appreciate your answers to these questions. I'm gonna move over to Eva now. Eva, my first question for you is, can you please reflect on the role of policies in creating barriers and or enabling the participation of trans people in sports and recreation?
Yeah, of course. So really depending on how a trans and non-binary participation policy is written, it can either create a huge number of barriers for trans and non-binary athletes, or it can enable their participation. But I will start off with sort of how they create barriers, because working in sporting spaces, this is what I have primarily seen these policies do. So for the most part, the vast majority of trans and non-binary policies, inclusion policies, both within the Canadian context and also globally, they institutionalize stigma, and they exclude trans and non-binary people through medical criteria and or social criteria. So most often the medical criteria specifically is around serum testosterone levels. And then sometimes in terms of the social criteria, trans and non-binary people are required to have lived in their identified gender for X number of years. And so these specific criteria embed discrimination into sporting organizations, because they require trans athletes to have to prove their eligibility in a way that cisgender athletes do not have to. Policies also reinforce and normalize the gender binary through the maintenance of male and female categories. And so when binary gender categories are reinforced, this means that many non-binary and gender diverse people are oftentimes faced with, I would say, the impossible decision of trying to fit themselves into a category. Most often these policies with the binary gender categories force non-binary and gender diverse people to fit into a sporting system that was never designed for them. Sports were created for cisgender people, and more specifically cisgender men. And so the maintenance of these categories continually reinforces that narrative. And the last sort of piece around barriers is that a lot of the time the medical criteria that these policies are based around sometimes force trans people to make the impossible decision between medically transitioning and participating. In terms of enabling participation, trans and non-binary participation policies, they can do a really great job at creating parameters that all individuals within an organization need to follow. So when there's no policies in place that speak to the participation of trans and non-binary individuals, it generally means that individuals in leadership positions, like coaches, for example, they basically get to then decide whether or not a trans person can participate. And oftentimes those decisions are based in that individual's personal opinions or biases about trans people. So what policies have the power to do is they can create some consistency in how trans people can participate. And guidelines also make it so there's less of a risk that coaches and organizational leaders will exclude trans people based on their own personal opinions about them.
I'm so grateful that you said that last piece, Eva, because it just reminds me of gatekeeping. When policies are so flippant and not clear, a lot of gatekeeping can happen from those that are in positions to then say, based on medical or social criteria, do you fit in this sport? That brings me to my second question is, what are common misconceptions that inform current policies?
It's a great question. I think this is what everyone's talking about all the time. So I would say I'm going to not touch upon all of the misconceptions just because there are so many of them, but a lot of the information that is being used to inform the creation of trans and non-binary participation policies is either misinformation or disinformation. So one of the main misconceptions that I see working in sporting spaces is that many of these policies are underpinned by the idea that there is one way to be a woman or one way to be a girl. And these policies also tend to naturalize the gender and sex binaries. And generally what these policies also do is they reinforce the idea that there is a definitive way of determining who is quote unquote female from a biological perspective. They say that people who are female or people who fit into there is a particular set of criteria that can be used to define who is female or who is a woman, and that it is something that can be measured. And so what this misconception does and how it plays out in practice when it's put into a policy is that it increases the scrutiny and surveillance of all women's bodies, not just trans women's bodies, but all women's bodies, cis and trans alike. Another misconception that's used to inform these policies is that trans women and girls have an unfair athletic advantage over cisgender women and girls. And so what this misconception does when it is embedded into a policy is that it masks transphobia under the guise of fairness. And so a really big misconception that sort of falls under this umbrella is that people think that testosterone is a predictor of sport performance. The data shows us that it is not. Data actually shows us that testosterone levels do not predict athletic ability or sport performance, and just overall hormone levels generally do not indicate how well a person will perform in a given sport. And in terms of this unfair athletic advantage misconception, this is such a large part of the discourse around particularly trans women and girls participating in sport. And so when these policies are being developed, there is a massive over-reliance on biomedical data and what the research shows us, and particularly a review that came out of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport in 2021 around the participation, just around trans women athletes in elite sport. They're showing that this biomedical data, which is methodologically flawed, is being overused in terms of informing these policies, and that sociocultural data and research also needs to be used when creating these policies. And the last misconception that I do want to touch upon is that there is an assumption that biology and physiology are the only factors that influence sport performance. But these criteria tend to fail to recognize the material conditions of trans people's lives. Trans people actually experience barriers in accessing employment, education, healthcare, and safe schooling environments. And all of these barriers and exclusionary factors result in negative mental, emotional, and physical outcomes that undoubtedly have an impact on sport performance. So kind of going back to the point that I just made earlier, is that we really need to be looking at the material and social conditions of trans people's lives, and we really need to be bringing that sociocultural research in when developing policies.
Thank you, Eva. I think that a lot of us have a lot of questions when it comes to policies. I know for us here in Alberta, we're going to be really curious about how this new proposed upcoming bill is going to affect not only access, but affect how we gatekeep and how we define who fits in where. So thanks for answering those questions. The last question I have for you is, what policies would you like to see implemented?
That's an amazing question. And I think about this all the time. But what I really want to see is I want to see trans and non-binary participation policies that start from a place of inclusion, not from a set of criteria. I want policies that humanize trans and non-binary people. I want policies that use respectful language to talk about us and our experiences. I want policies that don't have medical criteria and that don't try to conform people, don't try to force people to conform to a system that was, again, designed for cisgender people. I also dream of a day where sports try to stop trying to fit people into binary categories. And so one thing that I am really wanting sport organizations to do, and I have seen some sport organizations start to do this, is I want to see them create policies that challenge and disrupt the gender binary. And what I really want is I want policies where the names of gender categories are changed. So specifically when it comes to the men's category, I would love to see that category be renamed to open. It would be a category where anyone can participate regardless of their gender. In terms of the women and girls category, what I really want is I want that category to also be renamed, and I want it to be open to anyone who has a gender that is marginalized, so anyone of a marginalized gender. And so this category would exist to be a safer space for folks who experience that marginalization and that oppression based on just the gender that they have. So this would be a category that can include cisgender and transgender women and girls. It can also include non-binary, genderqueer, and gender diverse people, but it can also include transmasculine people and trans men. And I want there to be no medical criteria in place for that try to essentially police who can and who cannot participate in that category. So I want to see categories where, or criteria where, if it doesn't matter if a person is taking hormones or not taking hormones, I just want them to be able to participate in the category that they are most comfortable in. And I want them to feel respected. I want them to feel seen. And I want them to be able to find community and just have fun, because for me, community and joy and just the love of the sport are the reasons why I like to play. And I would love to be able to see other people experience that as well. And the last piece that I want to mention around the development of trans and non-binary participation policies is that when these policies are being developed, I want to see trans and non-binary people being consulted, and I want us to be asked what we need to feel safe and included. And so I think another important piece for me to mention here is that these policies and creating these policies and implementing them are really important because they seek to address the systemic barriers and oppression that trans and non-binary people experience. However, what I've seen is just largely when we do try to make sport more inclusive for trans people, typically what we end up doing is we typically only address the exclusion that white, thin, non-disabled trans people experience. And so this means that when we're developing trans inclusion policies or examining how we can make sporting cultures more inclusive for trans and non-binary people, it's extremely important that we consult with fat, disabled, racialized, including Indigenous and Black, trans and non-binary people, because they experience intersecting forms of oppression. Not all trans and non-binary people have the same experiences, and so we need to make sure that policies are considering the needs of all of us.
If I had a mic, I would drop it, but I don't have a mic. So your points are, it gives us a lot to think about too. And you made so many relevant points about, even by just having gendered categories of men and women, even if we're not talking about trans folks, we're still talking about policies that ricochet, like, or tell us what bodies can fit into those categories. There's so much policing that happens over bodies in sports that goes way beyond just, are you male or are you female, are you woman or are you man? Yeah, so those are excellent points, Eva, and I really appreciate you sharing all of that with us. With that being said, I am gonna open the floor up for Q&A. So how this is going to work one more time is I have a few questions coming in from those who are in person. If you are in person, you have the QR code, so please use that QR code to filter in your questions. And if you are online with me, there is a Q&A button here, so please feel free to use that Q&A function to enter any questions that you have. I am going to start with one question here, and this can really go to any one of you who feel like answering. So just unmute and we'll go from that way. We'll just do maybe for the first question, what would you say to sport and recreation administrators who struggle to back up their policies around inclusion or do not address, make excuses for the hindrance they have in place for gender diverse folks? I'll repeat the question. What would you say to sport and recreation administrators who struggle to back up their policies around inclusion or do not address or make excuses for the hindrance they have in place for gender diverse folks?
I might take this one just to start. It sounds like these individuals are coming from a lack of understanding. So from my experience working in the sporting space for the past few years, I would say that they need to be consulting with trans folks, but particularly with trans folks who specialize in trans inclusion in sports. So what I would recommend for these administrators is to identify a trusted consultant to help guide them through this process, because not only are they going to be needing to create some policy changes, but they also need to engage in some education for themselves and likely for their other staff members. So they really need to bring in a trans person or some other consultants who specialize in trans inclusion to be able to help them work through that.
Yeah, I was gonna kind of go with the same thing. Maybe even like an organization that specifically deals with trans athletes a lot, like even like Team Trans, something like that. Just because they seem to have more of the knowledge of how to go about those certain issues.
And just to even circle back to a point that Valentina made about laws need to be updated to represent current contexts, right? So I can't agree more to that. We have policies in sport that are outdated and do not represent the social contexts of athletes today. So yeah, I am going to move to another question here. How would sport look or feel in your wildest dreams? Now I'll repeat that. How would sport look or feel in your wildest dreams?
I think for me it would be no gender binary. Just going by skill level instead of gender.
I think for me, honestly, it's where everyone's included, everyone's able to play, no matter their, race, gender, disability. Everyone's included and able to play, because the way I see it, sports are, at the end of the day, sports are a game. Sports are meant to be fun. So I think everyone needs to be included and supported.
I'd sort of echo what both Ryder and Jessica said. I would also love to see sports not be centered around the gender binary, but I also recognize that would require our societal conditions to change as well, because it would essentially mean that girls and women don't experience discrimination or marginalization. So as much as I would love that to happen, I feel like it likely won't. But for me personally, what I would love is I want everyone to be able to participate regardless of their gender, and I want them to feel welcomed and supported and respected. But selfishly, as a trans person, I would love to be able to just like compete in sport with other trans people. I think that might be my dream. It would be amazing because it is, as a trans person, it's not very often that you find people that understand you and truly see you. And so being able to participate in a sporting environment with other trans people would be an amazing experience, and is definitely a dream of mine.
I gotta add my experience with Team Trans. The first game I walked into, it was just, it's just a practice to get to know everyone. There was something just truly euphoric about it, sharing the ice with people who, shared the same experience as you or similar experiences. It was incredible. I hope you get it.
Thank you. I do too. That sounds amazing.
Yeah. Another question, what glimmers of hope, affirming moments, if any, did you experience prior to being out in sport? How did those glimmers of hope affect your decision to stay in sport?
I guess a glimmer of hope. It didn't really affect my decision to stay in sport, but it may have earlier on if it had happened earlier on in my life. A glimmer of hope that I got was seeing Harrison Brown come out in the NWHL as a trans man, and the support and acceptance that he got. That that showed me that there was a possibility that I could potentially come out and be supported and have acceptance and play the game that I love. So that was a huge glimmer of hope for me, and it really affirmed just everything about who I was, that maybe I could come out and still play the game I love and be unburdened. So it didn't affect me staying in hockey, but prior to transitioning and leaving the game, if I had seen it earlier, it may have.
I recognize a name from one of the hundreds in our online panel, so I'm going to ask you this question. This person says, thank you all so much for sharing your experiences and for pointing out the inherent sexism underlying testosterone panic. Also, thank you to Valentina for highlighting the lessons that can be learned from inclusiveness demonstrated by the Paralympic approaches. And this person's question is for Eva. Is there a current Canadian policy around trans and non-binary participation that you find particularly good/inclusive? Continuing, can you also share the link to the research you mentioned that challenges the over-reliance on biomedical data? Let me know if you need me to repeat that question, Eva.
I think I'm okay for now. In terms of the research piece, it is in the resource guide that's in the chat. It's just specifically the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport report on trans women athletes and elite sports. So you can see that there. If you don't want to read the 86-page document, there's also an executive summary and another document as well, and they are much, much shorter. In terms of a trans participation policy in the Canadian context that I think is relatively good, I would say that Skate Canada is doing a relatively good job in this particular aspect, specifically around their pairings. So they don't require men and women to be paired together or boys and girls to be paired together. It's just mixed gender, and it doesn't really matter what the gender of the people in the pair is. So I'd say from that perspective, they're doing relatively well. I believe it's also Cycling Canada. I believe that their policy does not have any medical criteria in place for events that are not sanctioned by the International Federation. So I would say those are two organizations that are doing a relatively good job in terms of trans and non-binary inclusion. And So what I would like to see kind of other sporting organizations do is sort of take a combined approach of those two in terms of one, rethinking gender, renaming categories. So even if you don't necessarily have pairings in your sport, thinking about how you can rename your gender categories to be more inclusive of non-binary and gender diverse people. And then also from the medical aspect is removing medical eligibility criteria because we simply just don't have enough data to create that criteria.
Thank you, Eva. I do have one question, and it's a bit wordy, so I can repeat it if need be. This person says, when it comes to Bill 29, that's the legislation that I mentioned earlier by the UCP, there is no language within the bill itself that prohibits trans athletes from competing. However, what it does do is enable PSOs to create trans exclusionary or segregative eligibility policies and provides those organizations with legal safe haven from being sued for such policies. How are we supposed to fight against that? So I'll read it out one more time. When it comes to Bill 29, there is no language within the bill itself that prohibits trans athletes from competing. However, what it does do is enable PSOs to create trans exclusionary eligibility policies and provides those organizations with legal safe haven from being sued for such policies. What are we supposed to, or how are we supposed to fight against that?
This is a very complex question, so I'll attempt to address it, but with the caveat that I am not a lawyer or a law expert. But in terms of Bill 29, it does go against the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms because it does require sporting organizations to discriminate on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. So that place, it's a little bit difficult in terms of if this policy is actually like if it actually can go through from a kind of federal legislative standpoint. But in terms of like what we can do if this piece of legislation goes through and sporting organizations do create even more exclusionary trans participation policies is we have to fight back. We need to be contacting our MPs and our MPPs to talk about and tell them why we feel that this legislation is bad. We need to engage in collective community organization in order to advocate for ourselves and to hopefully get this bill repealed. So that's really all I can say is that we can fight back. Yes, if this bill does go through, organizations may be able to put these exclusionary policies in place, but there is power in numbers. And if we do organize together as members of trans communities, as well as allies and accomplices, then I am very confident that we can ensure that this legislation either doesn't go through or does get struck down.
And just to add to that as well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that policies are in place because there should have been research done in order to say this is the best practice. And the Bill 29, there was a lack of representation from trans non-binary athletes. There was also a lack of research speaking to actual science. And again, I can't circle back to the social context being one of the most important things that we need to remember. The social context being that trans athletes today are very different than trans athletes from 10, 15 years ago. We have trans athletes who have gone through like a period in their early adolescence of blocking their puberty blocking. And so we can't compare trans athletes today to trans athletes 15 years ago because social contexts have changed. And this bill doesn't properly acknowledge the scientific evidence that it should. So when you quote unquote think, how are we supposed to fight against that? By doing things like this and targeting misinformation, targeting biases and narratives that are extremely hurtful, and doing it to the right audience so people can gain the education that they need to make better decisions about inclusion and equity. And Jessica, I see that your mic is unmuted, so I'll let you speak to this as well.
Oh,
Oh, no, my mistake. Okay. I'll go to the next question here. Are there examples of effective policies in international sports that we should consider adopting or learning from here in Canada or Alberta? And I don't know, Valentina, if this might be a question that you would like to answer, since you're joining us from Italy. And I'll repeat that again. Are there examples of effective policies in international sport that we should consider here in Canada?
Se ci sono delle politiche internazionali che sono positive, che potrebbero considerare loro qui in Canada.
Allora, innanzitutto promuovere gli sport misti, quindi praticamente la pratica di...
La domanda, scusa, la domanda è se ci sono già delle pratiche sportive positive, non quello che si dovrebbe fare, ma quello che già esiste.
Quello che già esiste qui in Italia non abbiamo.
In Italia e in Europa, internazionale, ci sono delle cose positive.
A livello di regolamenti è quello inclusivo del mondo paralimpico, ma non del mondo olimpico.
So the best practice is in the Paralympic world, again, for inclusive rules. It's not the same in the Olympic world. So again, we go back to the Paralympic attitude towards diversity.
Infatti l'International Paralympic Committee, l'IPC, recepisce le indicazioni del CIO e la Federazione Internazionale di Paralimpica, World Parathletic, recepisce quanto indicato dal CIO, mentre invece World Athletics no.
So the International Paralympic Committee and the International Para-Athletics Organization adopt the policies prescribed by IOC, but the World Athletics Organization doesn't. So there is a big difference in these two sectors.
Quindi l'anomalia è di World Athletics e il problema è che il CIO, a fronte degli studi fatti, deve emanare, devono essere veri e propri regolamenti, non linee guida, deve obbligare le federazioni.
Okay, at this point, the IOC just gives guidelines. It doesn't give specific rules. So it would be much better if the IOC could prescribe regulations rather than just guidelines, because this allows the sports federations to do as they like. And with the athletics committee, the World Athletics Committee, we have a big problem.
Quindi io mi auspico che in futuro il CIO emani dei veri e propri regolamenti, non solo le linee guida.
Sì, questo l'ho detto. So we're waiting for the regulations from the IOC and not just guidelines. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Valentina. I have another question. This one is talking about, Eva, when you brought up your categories and the answer to your wildest dreams. This question says, for the open category you're proposing, if organizations decide to meet us halfway and only offer an open category, would it make sense to restrict this category to gender diverse individuals? Additionally, should access to the open category be granted only after a review process?
In terms of this, so sort of how I'm going to interpret this question, I don't know if this is quite right, but to me, this question kind of implies that there would be a men's category, a women's category, and then an open category. And the open category would be specific for non-binary and gender diverse individuals. I would not recommend that organizations do that, because that essentially creates a category just for trans people. And all that seeks to do is to further marginalize and other trans people. So I would really not recommend doing that. And then just in terms of determining eligibility or having guidelines around who's eligible to compete in what category, I again encourage sport organizations as much as possible to move away from having criteria, because what is that criteria that they're putting in place, and how are they going to measure it? There is too much biological diversity that exists in this world to actually create criteria to neatly fit people into 2 or even 3 categories. So I would really, really recommend not doing that. The research is just not there. And so if there is to be an open category, it really does need to be the men's category being renamed to open, and then making the women and girls category more inclusive to people of all marginalized genders. But I don't think a 3rd category should be created for trans and gender diverse people.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. Another question that is coming in: what physical barriers exist for trans and non-binary folks exist in that built environment sport? Sorry, this one is coming in a little wonky. I'm going to go to the other one because that one doesn't make sense. Overall, do you believe that we are going in the right direction towards a more inclusive future in sport?
Overall, I think we are going in the right direction. It may not be as fast as some of us may like, but I think overall we're making improvements and we're heading in the right direction. I'm generally a positive person, so it's pretty hard for me to think that we're going backwards. And that is to say, there's not some things, like, for example, Bill 29, that are trying to push us backwards, but overall, as a whole, I think we're moving forward.
I think I would agree with Jessica. As much as it seems like in the media that things are getting worse, I think it's just that more people are aware of us. So the small portion that we're going to be mad are just mad publicly. But from personal experience and from seeing some other trans athletes in my sport, generally, there's not really an issue with them competing. And I love to see that, because that feels like the right direction.
Thanks, Eb. I'm going to ask another question, and Eb, I think you might also be a good person to answer this as well. So this question says, a common rhetoric opposing the creation of a trans-only sports organization says that there are small numbers of trans athletes interested, causing there to be not enough of a demand. So 2 parts to this question. The first part: have you seen that there is a limited demand, or the opposite? And the second part of the question is, if there is a limited demand, what do you think is causing trans athletes to not pursue participation in sport?
I'd say that there's a little bit of both, because in gymnastics, I will say that there are not very many of us. But I also play roller derby, and we have a lot of trans people in roller derby. And I think it boils down to the knowledge that we're allowed to be there, because roller derby has 2 leagues internationally. There's the Women's Flat Track Derby Association and the Men's Roller Derby Association. But both of them have exceptionally open categories. The women's one says, like, women and non-binary people, but I've heard it explained as kind of, if you feel like you should be here, you should be here. And men's is the same. There's more women's leagues, just everywhere. So a lot more people will play women's roller derby. But it's just, you go in with the knowledge that you're allowed to be there. You don't have to stop along the way trying to ask administrators, can I be here? How can I be here? What do I need to do to be here? You're just, you know, you're allowed, so you can just be there.
Yeah, if I could add on that too. I know for hockey, Team Trans started a draft tournament, for example, in Minnesota. And it's typically about 6 to 8 teams in the tournament. And that is all different skill levels. And it pools from pretty much all over North America. People come in for this tournament. And that's all trans, and they only get about 6 to 8 teams. Now, I think it's growing, but I think that is because more trans people are feeling welcome to come back into sport or come back into playing hockey, or, you know, find this tournament a safe tournament to play in. So there is limited demand because these trans athletes are not feeling safe to play in their sport. They're not feeling included. They're not feeling like they belong, like they're welcome. So I think if sports as a whole, or hockey in my case, is able to welcome more people and make people feel like they belong, make people feel like they don't have to quit playing hockey, there may be more demand. And then maybe we could have, way down the road, once, you know, if there's enough demand, maybe we could have teams or leagues. But as things stand right now, that's just not the case.
I'll move over to another question. So this question comes in and says, I have 2 children that are very active in sport. They're both under the age of 16 and are already proving to be extremely athletic. One of them is non-binary, while the other one identifies as transgender. The school has been working really diligently to support both of them in participating in the sport of their choosing. However, my transgender daughter is now being told that she will not be able, or she may not be able to continue playing basketball next year. Can anyone speak to how I can best advocate for my daughter, but for all trans young girls in schools that may or may not be told next year that they can no longer play in their sport of choice?
I'm going to guess that this question sort of comes from the Alberta context and is sort of prefaced by the potential for Bill 29. So what I would say is, right now the bill is not legislation, so schools should not be sort of setting the stage that your child who's trans is not going to be able to participate. So right now that there is no legislation in place that can justify them excluding your child. In terms of, like, if the legislation does go through, or even just to sort of help you advocate for your child better, is there are community organizations that are doing work. So I would recommend connecting with queer and trans community-based organizations to sort of help you in terms of like expanding your understanding and also help you with engaging in advocacy work. Many community-based queer and trans organizations already do a lot of advocacy work. There's many organizations particularly doing advocacy work around the 2 other proposed anti-trans bills in Alberta right now. And so a lot of work is being done. So if you connect with them, they can help you figure out how you can advocate better. And also maybe even connect you with other people who are other parents who are going through similar things with their kids in their kids' schools or school boards. And so you may be able to find sort of connection and connection that way.
I will say that I am part of like a grassroots organization that I started Trans Inclusive Athletes of Alberta, and we are trying to do something about these policies. We're trying to stop them basically. But yeah, and then I also know, like, if you're in YEG, but even if you're not in the Edmonton area, there is Trans Rights YEG, and they seem to do a lot, especially towards the legislator. And then there's also Queer Momentum.
Yeah, thanks for those resources, Ryder. And just to add to, I can't preface what Eva said, that this policy that the UCP is saying is not set in stone yet, and so there shouldn't be any exclusion happening for any young kids in school. So definitely needing to connect to supports. So if you are curious about those supports, please email the three of us that are running this project and this teach-in, and we can link you to resources. Another question that came in is, how can cis team members support trans teammates? And what kind of allyship might be most helpful when trans athletes are being targeted for harm by opposing teams or by their team's coaches and sports leaders? So I'm just going to repeat that question. How can cis team members support trans teammates? And what kind of allyship might be most helpful when trans athletes are being targeted for harm by opposing teams or by their teams' coaches and sport leaders?
I think that cis team members can support trans teammates by getting educated. Like, if you're really knowledgeable in, trans issues, what that trans person is experiencing, you can help do your part to dispel common misconceptions, and that can lead to more acceptance. Personally, what I would like as a trans person is if my cis teammates would practice active allyship and really stick up for me. If they hear someone saying something wrong, say something and stand up for me. And that goes for, not just while I'm around. If I'm not in the room and someone says something bad behind my back, stand up for me, say something, and hopefully the entire team will kind of get the message, and it'll just create a more cohesive team environment. And when teams work together, teams do better. As for being targeted by harm by opposing teams or by the team's coaches and sports leaders, I know for hockey on the ice, there's not really too much you can do in the moment, except maybe say something to another player, defend the trans player as best you can. If you happen to know the people on the other team, maybe talk with them after, have a discussion, maybe try and educate them. And if it's bad enough, report it. There are harassment policies in most leagues, most sports, and if you report it, it can be addressed. And that goes for the team's coaches and the sports leaders as well. There is pretty much always someone above. There's pretty much always someone above, like the coach. There's the people who run the league. And if it's the people who run the league are the problem, there is, a provincial governing body or a national governing body. There is someone that you can report them to if you need to.
Yeah, absolutely. This next question says, how can coaches best support trans athletes in the face of Bill 29, but also experience of transphobia within their team or organization? how can coaches best support trans athletes in the face of Bill 29, but also experiences of transphobia within their team or organization?
I can actually answer this one really well because the way that my coach did it was perfect. So when everything was really, really bad on that team, the one person I did have supporting me was my coach. It was the head coach. Like, he was really good. He basically contacted Hockey Alberta himself, got the information he needed, and then sent it to the main board of directors for that hockey organization, and was like, here, this is what I know. This is the actual policy that actually exists, not the one you're saying exists. What you are doing is not by Hockey Alberta policy. And like, within a week, I was allowed in the men's change room. Like, so I think it's a lot of like coaches sticking up, looking for the information that they need to support those trans athletes, and being able to be like, no, this isn't correct. This is actually what's correct.
Okay. Valentina would like to answer the question also. Okay.
Yes. Sì, volevo raccontare la mia esperienza riguardo gli allenatori.
Wanted to tell her experience about coaches.
Il mio primo allenatore che mi conosceva in versione maschile e con quale avevo vinto 12 titoli italiani.
My first coach who knew me in my male version, and I had won 12 titles, Italian competitions.
Quando ho fatto coming out, purtroppo ho dovuto cambiare allenatore perché lui mi ha espressamente detto che non credeva nel mio percorso.
When I came out, I had to change a coach because that coach didn't believe in my process. E poi?
L'allenatore che poi ho trovato successivamente invece ha avuto una piena inclusione e mi ha accettato e mi ha subito chiamato con il mio pronome di elezione femminile.
The following coach that I had started really an inclusive process with me, and he called me by my female name right away.
Okay.
Passa?
Sì.
Okay.
Thank you, Valentina, and thank you, Ryder, for your responses. I have another question here, and this one's a bit wordy, so let me know if I need to read it twice. But this person says, I want to advocate with my PSO to allow trans women to compete with bio women. I'm afraid that when I do speak up, that the executive gets offended and turns around and upright bans transgender athletes from competing altogether. If Bill 29 in Alberta gets passed, there will be legal protection for PSOs if they did that. So how should one advocate loudly for trans athletes?
Maybe I'll kind of start off with this one. What I would say is within your PSO, they will likely have a place where you can submit feedback or submit concerns. So I would sort of explore avenues for that. Oftentimes PSOs will have an email available or even an online form. Sometimes these are anonymous, particularly if they're anonymous. That's a place where you can maybe start by and voice your concerns to folks in leadership positions within your PSO. And another piece is that if you don't want to be the only person trying to advocate for the inclusion of trans feminine people, talk to other folks in your PSO. I don't know specifically what position you're in, but if you're an athlete, talk to other athletes, talk to coaches, talk to trainers, talk to other staff, and talk to them about why you think this is so important, why this is important to you, and get them to also advocate alongside you, because there is power in numbers. And so if multiple people bring up the fact that they want there to be a greater level of trans inclusion within your particular PSO, then people in leadership positions are more likely to want to listen and to engage in that dialogue with you.
And that just goes to show that again, like I keep going back to Eva, what you said when you were answering the questions at the beginning about gatekeeping happens when policies are not clear and up for debate. And Bill 29 is unfortunately providing that for us. Is just the bill is there and it says a lot of things, but we don't know what exactly it says. But the only thing that's quite set in stone for us is understanding the legal repercussions if people don't follow through. And that it's not just for the world of sport and athletics, but it's also for teachers. So another question that's coming in, and maybe I'll do another 2 questions and then we can wrap up. But the question that came in is, do you have any examples of what quote unquote active allyship looks like?
For me, I would say active allyship would be, if you're with a team and, some people on your team are making fun of you, or some people on my team are making fun of me, then, someone on the other team speaks up and tells them, hey, that's not okay. This is why, and, defends me. That person has my back. That person, it doesn't really affect them, but they see how it might affect me and they're defending me. Active allyship is, it's not just talking the talk to me, it's walking the walk. You can say you're supportive, you can say you accept trans people, you can say that you're the most inclusive person in the world, but if when push comes to shove, you're not saying anything, you're not doing anything, it's just words. And while words do have a lot of power sometimes, we need actions.
And I just want to add to that. That was very, very well said. Whenever we are in a greater position of privilege or power, it's so much easier for us. And so if we're talking about cis and trans athletes, it's so much easier for cis people to stand up and say something if there is an incident of transphobia, because you're coming from a relative position of privilege and power. And so you are much less likely to experience reprisal or negative repercussions from speaking out against transphobia. So if you're scared in terms of engaging allyship, you don't really know how people are going to react. I would really encourage you to sort of like sit with that discomfort and like lean into it, because trans folks experience discomfort on a daily basis. We navigate transphobia all the time in both interpersonal interactions, but also just in societal structures in general. And so I really encourage you to lean into that discomfort. And if it scares you, you're probably doing the right thing.
I like that last thing that you said, Eva. If it scares you, that probably because you're doing the right thing. And so the last question that I'll pose for all of you, if you would like to take a chance to answer this, is what is one piece of advice you would give to post-secondary athletic programs about how they could better support trans athletes?
I guess I'll start with this one. I'll be pretty quick. I would say to base your policies on science and, have the information and the science to back up your policies. Don't just fold to societal pressures, to political pressures. And if you do have a trans athlete, make sure you have supports in place. Make sure, the coaches have the information they need. Make sure that the person has the supports that they need in place in case they have an issue. Like everyone knows what to do. And have that player's back. If anything happens, if there's pushback from, other post-secondary athletics programs, defend them, have their back.
One piece that I want to add is that I really think it's important for post-secondary athletic programs to develop and communicate the responsibilities of everyone within that program, particularly as it pertains to trans and non-binary inclusion. So this means developing and communicating responsibilities for athletic directors, for coaches, for athletics staff, as well as for athletes. So this can include creating things like education plans for people in different types of positions to support their understanding of trans and non-binary inclusion in sport. This also means creating things like safety plans and ensuring that those are in place so that the well-being of trans and non-binary athletes is protected. It also means creating ways that student athletes can share their chosen name and pronouns, as well as uniform styles that they're more comfortable with. And also it's really important for athletics programs to make plans and develop actions that align with the commitments that they are making around trans and non-binary inclusion. Saying you're inclusive is not enough. You actually need to follow it through with actions. Like, what are you actually going to do to support trans and non-binary athletes?
I would
couldn't
agree
second
with
that.
what was already said, and just like as a bare minimum, just be very explicit in the fact that everyone is welcome. Because if you're like, we're inclusive, but you don't say we are inclusive and you are allowed to be here in this place specifically, like there's a lot of things where if you're looking to join a sport and you're like, well, I'm not really sure, and I don't know these people, I don't want to go up and I don't want to ask these kind of personal questions about whether or not I particularly am allowed to be here. Like if I know I'm allowed to be there, that's really helpful.
Yeah. I couldn't second those thoughts. Backing up, when you say we are inclusive, backing it up with what that means. We are inclusive is it's just a simple statement. It's not a promise. It's not an action. It's just saying that you aspire to be something. So what does that mean, right? Okay, folks, I want to take one last opportunity to say thank you so much for joining us, to these panelists. Thank you so much for sharing not only your wisdom and lived experience, but giving us hope, right? Sitting with other trans athletes reminds me that there is hope and there is a way around this. And I know that we in Alberta are a little scared right now because of Bill 29. But after hearing these conversations, it just ignites that activism, right? It gives us a purpose to keep being loud and throwing down whatever biases and narratives are out there that are hurting people's understanding of what it means to be a trans athlete. So thank you all so very much. For those of you who are online, thank you for joining us. Thanks for sitting with us. And for those of you in person, I hope you enjoyed the snacks in the back of the room. So again, thank you, but we'll end here for today.
Thank you.
Successo.
Devi dire grazie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.